Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Why are we in a handbasket? I'm very excited today to talk to our guests. Before we introduce them, I want to make sure you know who the voices are in this podcast. I am one of those voices. Yes, this is a body is making this voice. And that body normally goes by the name Richard Littauer. Hello, everyone. Your normal voice today. No other hosts, but that's okay because we have amazing friends joining us and amazing people who have been in this podcast before. Let's see if you can recognize them. Behind door number one, we have someone with a floral background. How are you doing today?
Oh, hi. I am Tracy Hinds. I'm doing great. I am recovering web engineer for folks who do not know me or don't know where I'm at now. I'm currently the CFO and board director at the Open Source Initiative. And I'm really excited to be here today and talk with Richard and Ashley about all of this fun stuff that we've been obsessing over for so many years.
Thank you, Tracy, for completely destroying my game show version of this podcast. That's fine. Just went right in and said who you were. Ashley Williams, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm always a little grumpy, though. It's kind of like a personality thing.
With reason. Ashley, of course, is from the Northeast. I always associate you with Boston for some reason.
Well, it's
maybe
where
Pittsburgh.
we met because we were teaching Node together when I was working at Boku in Boston.
Way back in the day. Since then, you've gone through several war zones of open source, and you and Tracy have been working together for a while. And so the reason for this podcast, listeners, is that last week I was talking to Tracy and Ashley, and we just had a great conversation. And I'm like, we should just come on the podcast and talk about structural inequities and issues with funding in open source in general. So we don't often have this kind of podcast. There's nothing to shill here. There's no one who's going to be, hello, I work here and you should donate. It's just more, wow, everything is totally screwed. And we should talk about that together in like a really honest way. Ashley, you're laughing first. So why don't you talk a bit about what I mean by everything is totally screwed and how you see it?
Oh my gosh, everything is totally screwed. So as someone who loves to die on hills, I guess the first thing I should say is like, maybe everything isn't totally screwed, maybe. But there's certainly a lot of misaligned incentives that are currently happening in open source. And thanks to the success in many ways of open source, we're pouring a lot of gasoline on the fire of these structural problems. I don't know. I think people have recognized this for a really long time. There's literally a podcast called Sustain, focused on sustainability issues in open source. And I suspect that maybe even that alone would suggest that like there's recognition of these issues. However, I do think we're at a really interesting turning point. And so it's like, why are we talking about everything on fire today versus talking about everything on fire many, many years ago, which I've also done? There's a couple of really important ones, but one that I think is very interesting is, so we've had open source. People who maintain open source don't really make a lot of money from it. Attempts to sustain open source have largely failed. And they continue to fail to like greater and greater disaster, to the point that those disasters are actually affecting the larger economy, not just the maintainers' economies. And that's making people like governments notice. And so we're starting to see like a bunch of regulatory and policy work happening in global governments. And there's a cool opportunity, I think, for that to level the playing field and give maintainers the opportunity to not just sustain, but probably grow and build the structures that they need to grow and support themselves. I do think part of the issue, and not because I don't love the name of this podcast and stuff, but maybe the problem is that we've just been focused on sustaining open source and not maybe like thriving. Does that sound too like...
No, it doesn't. I've given a talk a couple places now, and how sustain is the worst term ever, and I hate it. So we're together on that. But, you know, we can agree that at least the fire of communal sharing of code for the good of the world populace, for the good of people who want to do great work, who can't reinvent the wheel every time, is important. And it is important that we work together on that, right? I have another podcast that started recently you should listen to called Open Source for Climate, where I'm talking just specifically about how we can use open source technology to help fight the climate crisis, right? The biggest issue that we have today. That's important work. Whether or not we need to have left pad be sustained forever,
Poking the bear on purpose? You know, I was at NPM when that happened.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. It was one of my, it defined, I think, my understanding of the value of policy in open source for what it's worth. I became that revolutionized, or radicalized me.
And it was one of the first cases where you're talking about where we ended up with an issue that was for open source developers, became an issue for other people elsewhere. And they're like, whoa, what's going on here? Heartbleed was also very bad. There's been others since Log4j, but Left Bad was one of the ones where it's like, oh, okay, this is awkward. You mentioned earlier misaligned incentives, which I think is a really good way of thinking about a lot of open source stuff. People want to do X and they get X for it, but they really wanted Y, and it just doesn't really work. But you also mentioned, well, now we have this great opportunity for all these maintainers to get together to build a better world for policymakers.
Whoa, build a better world for policymakers.
Can you explain more? Because I don't see any maintainer going around and combing through the CRA with a fine tooth brush. What do you mean by let's get people together to work on this stuff? I'm not incentivized to be a lawyer. I'm incentivized to be a hacker. Okay,
so every open source developer is somehow incentivized to also be a lawyer. Have you ever read Reddit? I've seen this. There's an obvious correlation here between people who are open source developers and how much they want to be a lawyer. They're not very good lawyers all the time, but open source, and I hate to talk about open source and licenses, of course, or the legal foundation there is aligned. But I guess to speak a little bit more about why I think the regulation portion of things is so interesting is it comes into actually economics. God, this is going to get nerdy. You're going to want to edit all of this. So right now in open source, there's a lot of value that is generated, but it is not captured. And the economic term for this kind of situation is an externality. It's basically a side effect of a market that is not captured by the market. An example of this is pollution from manufacturing. That is an externality, is not handled by the market. And when these happen in economics, you can have positive and negative externalities. Most externalities are pretty negative. The economists like to say that maybe there are positive ones. I don't see a ton of them. Maybe there's some in research, but the way you handle externalities in a market is via regulation and also often via taxes. Both of these mechanisms are very interesting, and we're actually seeing those now in open source. So in many ways, the timeline is going the way the timeline is supposed to, right?
We are not seeing taxes yet in open source. We're seeing Circuit talk about taxes, but I haven't seen that yet.
Not taxes. We are seeing regulation.
Yes.
So I didn't mean the whole set. There are actually people discussing taxes, hilariously not in government spheres, but in private
spheres. Yeah.
So, but I think we're seeing the general zeitgeist approaching solutions that start to look like this, which means that the general understanding of the problem is converging, at least in general. Now, what's cool about these types of solutions is that they are opportunities in many ways to kind of level the playing field or engage in this market in a different way. And so what I'm excited about with the opportunity is there's regulations that are coming out about SBOM, software bills of materials, all the acronym soup that's coming out about saying I swear this is the software I told you it was. A lot of open source developers are really pissed about this stuff right now. And I get why, because they feel like it's more work and less pay. But the second half of that is not necessarily true. The more work part is, but I do think that there's a massive opportunity here for the more work to actually be compensated, especially when it's required by government policy. And so that's something I'm excited about. And there's a lot of things that are moving in this direction. There was a whole bunch of open source developers that got emails from NASA a month ago or something, being please confirm this information. Many companies, this all happens during the procurement process. Part of the procurement process is buying the software. And so in an ecosystem where there was never a moment to say hey, this transaction should require a monetary compensation. In open source, that didn't really exist before, but now all these companies that are demanding attestations and these security documents, that moment is being created. And so there's an opportunity to capture value at that moment.
And even more so when we sort of talked about how open source maintainers and builders could, right, policy work, regulatory work might need to be more interesting to them now, because a lot of this was discussed. It was discussed in policy-making rooms without a lot of open source builders there. And I'm not saying we need one package writer or one maintainer to be sitting in a room with people, but we do need those conversations to be happening a little closer to the source, because otherwise what ends up happening, right, is that we have organizations of organizations of organizations showing up in Washington, showing up in the EU, and showing up in these different places, and they're speaking for everyone. And they're not doing it nefariously, right? They're doing it because they do want to make sure that there are people who are subject matter experts that are being listened to in this policy work and when these regulatory bodies are convening to write this stuff. But they may not have engineers in the room. They may not have people who are actually actively building on all of this. And we can see where there's big gaps. Like right now with the CRA, there will be times for revision. It's not written in stone, but it is going to happen, right? It's going to be out in the world. And we've got about 2 to 3 years to really get things in open source right, because we are going to be feeling the impact. And it doesn't just affect people in the EU. That just happens to be one of, the regulatory centers of the universe.
Both of you are very eloquent and awesome, and this is a lot to take in. And I have a few questions. So one of them is that you keep talking about this opportunity. And to me, it seems like opportunity of like, there's a lot of fish in the ocean. We could all go fishing. I'm like, yeah, but I don't have a boat, man. Like, how am I supposed to get out to where the fish are? And so one of them, we talk about the lobbyists, the people working on behalf of open source are generally large companies, right? Microsoft, Facebook, and then large foundations, Linux Foundation, Eclipse. These are the people in the room. And the people in the room are generally people who've also been in open source for like 40, 50 years and risen up to the top in these companies and are no longer maintainers of packages. Maybe they were back in like Fortran days, no offense to anyone. But like normally people who are working for a large foundation or a large company are now policy makers and managers because they've moved on from doing stuff. I don't know how we get the Sindre Sorhoses of the world in these rooms and whether they'd even want to, right? For one, he's Norwegian. So what are we talking about in terms of opportunities? Where are you seeing a coalition of the willing coming?
One of the things I was going to say is IBM's going to be so mad that you didn't list them.
They'll get over it. They've had other issues over the years.
Yeah. I mean, so this is not going to exactly address your point, but it is going to start maybe making an inroad on it. So open source is like not a new thing anymore. Open source hasn't been a new thing for a super long time. And in fact, open source hasn't been one singular thing in an extra long period of time. And I think we've seen some generations of like open source structure, open source like kind of foundation work happen over the years. But as time has passed, how open source changes over time has also, I think, accelerated. And so a lot of the organizations we're seeing that currently exist are focused on like a very particular type of open source. But there's a lot more types. And like as open source like grows and it's like, what do you even call open source as a thing? Open source ecosystem. There's a lot of different types. And so like we had like probably one of the biggest problems is that like the OG open source project that made people go, oh, we need to have some like more structure around this. We need to like get commercial entities involved. And maybe this is revisionist history, in which case everyone should cancel me on the internet, but it's Linux. And what's unfortunate is that Linux is such like a unique project that all the structures that you build to support a project like Linux translate incredibly terribly to like almost every other type of open source project. And like, that's a lesson that we like kind of still haven't learned. And like, I think that there is a general understanding around it that is true. Like, I at least talk to people and people like nod now when I say things like that. But I haven't seen us like building organizations that like respond to that being the case. Instead, what I've started seeing is a lot of projects that originally were like kind of very different from Linux, attempts to make those projects look more and more like Linux. And this becomes a problem because in order for a project to really look like the Linux open source project, it has to be really, really, really big and like have a large impact surface area. Whereas open source in general has been very successful, I think, because of plurality, both of contributors and stakeholders, but also of options. And a lot of projects are like too small for this model to work in many ways.
I feel like you're discounting the work that the PSF and similar language specific foundations and also non-foundational models that aren't specific, such as Open Source Collective with like 3,000 different projects. They have some bargaining power. It's not a lot of bargaining power, and they don't have a ton of policy analysts waiting on staff. They potentially could.
I agree, I think, with the PSF. The PSF has been doing like a lot more to support ecosystem stuff. I will say, and again, maybe like come for me in the comments or whatever, but a lot of language-based foundational communities do functionally nothing for their ecosystem. Like I don't even think they do it nefariously.
Well,
I mean,
I would like to.
I met doing Node Foundation, right? And I was working at NPM at the time. I think it would be undeniable to say that Node took off because of its library ecosystem. I'll take that stand, sure. Like without the NPM package registry, not the registry software itself, but all the software it contained, if that didn't exist, I don't think Node would have been terribly popular. And I do know that the OpenJS Foundation, as it's now called, like definitely like has some incubator style project to help support some of the library ecosystem. But ultimately, like the traditional foundation structure has misaligned incentives with supporting something like a library structure, because foundation structures centralize support structures. And there are just so many different projects that you would have to scale the overhead of a foundation incredibly high to be able to support all of the people that are working on all of those projects.
Yeah, I think also as part of this, though, like I think PSF is a great example, Richard, of what you were saying, and even Open Collective, right? It's the scope of what they're trying to do. And I think, again, like PSF as the example, they do such a great job of cultivating, like making a place at the table. It is the table, the builders of Python, right? Like everyone there representing. But again, like even with any of these nonprofit, like open source foundations, you only have so much capacity. And what are you focused on? So one of the million things that the PSF does is try to help support the ecosystem of people who are getting paid to be writing Python, because that certainly behooves them, right? They want that. That's really important for the sustainability and stability of Python, right? That's really important. And Open Collective is doing really important work as well in trying to find other ways to help sustain people getting paid to do that work as well. But there's a place for all of these things, right? I think that they have filled gaps. The Linux Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, they filled gaps. They have served and serve a purpose to this day in what they do. And that was needed, right? People wouldn't be getting paid to work full time doing open source at these major corporations if these places like Linux Foundation hadn't advocated and shown the business value of that. Like, let's just be plain and simple. People need to eat. We live under capitalism. Many of us do. And trying to find a way to get paid to do this work is not on everybody's mind, but there are a lot of people that are, and they're not all going to work at these big corporations. There's other ways to get paid full time. Some of these smaller programming language specific foundations are also trying to find ways, right, to help pull in and get people compensated for that work, because it's niche, but there's 5 people in the world that do that work, and it's so vital, right? That's
I would add to that. Yes. And one of the things that they do is they do provide support to the ecosystem by convening. And so in terms of like AWS services, et cetera, in terms of like, here's $50 voucher to do whatever you need to do on your server, et cetera. I don't know. I can't think of better examples. That sort of support, centralizing it, yeah, it doesn't work very well. I would agree with that. Ashley, right there with you on that. But in terms of like, hey, PyCon is where Python people talk to each other, and there's a forum where someone's moderating that, that's all labor. And it's very useful to have someone at least holding the space for those conversations to happen. Not necessarily remunerating for all that labor properly, but at least I know if I'm going to talk to people, like that's where I talk to people. That's very useful to me as a social anthropologist lens type person. I agree that most of the time that may not be that important to me. If I'm just a hacker type person, I'm just working on my one project. I know the other cool projects. I don't need to know about anything else and whatever. Screw you. But it does help people say, oh yeah, I work on Python. You've heard of Python. Oh yeah, you've heard of them because you've been to the PSF, or you've read the book that someone made with the help of other people that they met at the PSF, blah, 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 right? Those things are helpful. What they don't do particularly well yet is enable functional conversation from maintainers to governments about how to standardize and regulate the open source ecosystem. That is very difficult to do. And if you know how to talk to governments at all, let me know, because man, we could make a lot of money, or at least happy times. Don't know what that meant, but like anything. Like if you figure that out, let me know. And that's where I think the opportunity is that you're talking about. We need to figure out how to do that more effectively, and especially how to take it out of back rooms where certain people get invited to Washington and other people don't. Sometimes based upon the title on your LinkedIn profile or the passport that you have in your pocket. And so there needs to be other ways of doing that. And also other extreme levels of privilege, like whether you have a beard or whether you speak with this accent.
I would push back on one thing, and it's absolutely possible that my personal experience is just the slice of this that has maybe been more unfortunate.
You're a bit crusty, sorry.
Sure. But this started when I was on the Node Foundation board, I had a special title, and my title was the Individual Membership Director. And ultimately what this was supposed to be was the Node Foundation was supposed to have a membership of all of the individual people in like, quote unquote, the Node community. Now, I think I'm putting scare quotes here because this is in audio, you can't see those. But the idea that one open source project has a single community is like extremely messy. Usually it's communities. And if I'm being honest, like I haven't seen that ever facilitated particularly well, not only from foundations, but I would say also just from like general project technical steering work. And I can say this as somebody who ran community teams in both Node and Rust. And I'm going to say, I don't think it went very well at all. There's someone who was like, the committers are the community or something. And I know that there's been like a lot of movement to try and like make open and like participation in the community recognize more roles than just like you're the person that sends commits to the language repo. But I don't think we've really grown all that far from that. And like mostly what I'm just trying to say is an extension of what you're saying is like, it's hilarious to think that we could, with current structures today, get maintainer voices to government tables. Because I think we struggle to get diverse stakeholder voices to like team tables, like even on smaller scales. Like we've seen the end of like the BDFL, I think in many ways, like enough people will cringe at the idea of a BDFL at this point. The like Overton window there has shifted. I don't think that we've seen like great examples of governance after that. I think people are trying, like there is some representation, but like I think this type of community work is hard. And a lot of people do not fully see the value in it. And so I think it just often does not get done. Like most foundations at this point, my director role, I was the only person to ever hold it. They got rid of it. They thought it was a bad idea. And the idea of having like an individual membership was decided that was a bad idea. Like no more community voice on a board. And they decided that was just like a bad call. And maybe it's like I ruined it.
No, you didn't. You also, it shifted. So it shifted because I ended up being the first community seat. Like it was named community seat, director seat on the board. So I ended up with a community committee.
I have a couple of points that are related to that. One of them is your expectations are super high, which is why you sound super cynical, right? Because you really want the most out of everything, and it's really hard when you don't get it. And I think that's great. And then two, don't downplay the growth is being important. We hadn't tried that yet. We tried it. It didn't work. We tried community. ComCom went great. Everyone is happy.
Yep.
You know?
But then it's gone, right? It also evolved. That name is gone. They've also shifted. If these things have evolved past us, which is actually comforting for me, at least, when I go back and revisit all of those repos and the work that we've done and the things that we've typed and the governance that took a year to change this one line and a thing that made a huge difference in power dynamics. It matters, but it's funny how much it gets lost in everything that we do, right? Because I think people take that for granted. I'm not saying you do, Ashley, because I know you know it intimately. But I think that that's the same thing that happens when we're talking, how do we get the right people at the table? This is something that I've always I'm very fascinated with. How do I do the sticky work that nobody wants to do to make that happen? So does it make sense for an individual maintainer to be sitting at a table in Washington? Sometimes, yes, there's some really cool stuff that's happening right now, at least in the security sphere, thanks to the executive order that happened, was it last year? But
3 years ago. But yeah, it feels like yesterday.
No, okay. Yeah, I'm in pandemic.
There was another thing that happened recently that wasn't the executive order. That was the coalition for safety first or.
Yeah, and the year of open science is over now, so no more open science. We're fine.
Yeah. But we do talk about how, we're starting to see people pulled in. They're getting tapped. They're getting emailed. They're saying, hey, next week, we're going to convene this thing that we really need your feedback on. And this is happening because more people who have done the work and do the work in open source are in positions of power or in positions of listening to allow those convenings to happen. And I think what I'm trying to say is there's just not enough of those yet, right? We need more of that. We need more organizations who are helping flag when these opportunities are happening. We need more translation because there are lots of maintainers who are never going to want to sit in that room, who are never going to be interested in spending that energy, but absolutely need you to advocate for them. And that's either on an individual level for the project work that they do, or for the idea of potential business opportunity that circles their project work. Sort of circling back to what we had alluded to with the CRA, there's a lot of opportunity, just like there has always been in open source, around getting paid to do this really important thing that you care about, that you've adapted and learned knowledge around. And people would pay you to do that work, but it has to be frictionless, just like a business. There has to be a platform. There has to be an entity. There has to be a simple way to hand you money, right? So organizations like GitHub sponsors, Patreon, right? Open Collective, Tidelift, they're allowing ways to help reduce that barrier, reduce that friction. But there's not enough of that. These open source foundations, they have built up this knowledge base, this way to educate both consumers and builders around open source. But what I think we have not done enough of, and we're starting to see more of now in sort of the shape of accelerators and venture studios that are more focused on open, is that there is so much untouched opportunity to be able, if you are so inclined, to learn how to build a business around the work you're doing in open source.
Well, that's exciting. I would love to see more of that. I really want to see just more funds going to open source maintainers in new ways. I don't want to see more crypto funds go to maintainers doing stuff in new ways. I just don't. I'm sorry, everyone.
Yeah.
John, I'm sorry.
I want to put a small spin on what Tracy said. I don't disagree with anything Tracy said, except for what sounded a little bit like optimism, which, of course, I want to be the party pooper here. I think that there is a very, very, very big force that is actually opposing the kind of fostering and empowering of this plurality of little open source businesses. So if we take a look at open source and kind of how it's grown through open source foundations, largely, I would argue, due to the corporate structures of those foundations being 501c6s, membership-based organizations that are very pay to play, as well as general trends in the tech industry that have largely grown in a very, is antitrust friendly environment okay to say?
I really like that.
Anyways, there's a lot of really big tech orgs and not a lot of anything that comes close to being a big tech org. There's a big old gulf there. And I think both of those have led to what I think is an obvious consolidation in open source. Not everyone thinks it's as obvious as I think it is. I think it's reasonably obvious. The way people are getting paid in open source is to join large tech organizations. That is by far the number one way that it works. I guess you could argue with that. I think it's pretty just obvious at this point. The other thing that's pretty scary about this is we talked about all this regulation happening in the security space. It turns out that having like a long tail of anons and cat girls like committing to your critical open source projects, they don't see that long tail as why open source is awesome, like I do. They say, the fact that this is open and I can collaborate on it with my competitors and not be doing a crime is why this is important. And so they are motivated to actually reduce the number of contributors on open source projects to those who are identifiable and work at the big, large companies that are all members of the foundations. So I don't think anyone is saying that out loud as their goal. I think that there's a lot of moves made by a lot of organizations that would suggest that that is inevitable on a medium-term timescale if there are not efforts put to push back against that. Mostly because, honestly, participating in open source at the level of impact that you would want to have like any sort of like effect on like how the project grows or how it handles its community would require so much time that if you were to spend that time uncompensated, it would basically be impossible. And that's becoming more and more true. And that is what deeply motivates me to go, okay, how do we make that path viable and awesome? Because I want more people at the table, because again, I think we end up with better outcomes, and plurality is why open source is cool. Not everyone thinks that's true.
It's also very easy to grasp and clear, and there's no possible conversation that could come out of anything you just said, which is my way of saying it's time, actually. We're running up on time. This has always been great talking to you both. Super awesome. I do actually really like that view of open source that large players, are kind of maybe making things. But that's also probably because I was raised by conspiracy theorists. And so my brain just naturally goes to those things. So I'm going to work hard now to make sure that's not true because I'm a scientist. But anyway, excellent advice and thoughts today. Given that we are running up on time, this was a cool conversation. You two are obviously in lots of cool conversations all the time, trying to figure out how to make open source work really well. Where can we follow your conversations online in the future? And are there any conversations that you want us to join in? And where can we find those?
Well, I guess is it very millennial of me that I'm like still on Twitter, which is now called X, and I'm afraid of TikTok? It might be. Anyways, yeah, so I mean, there's the obvious social media elements, but one of the things that I'm really excited about, we've mentioned it a couple of times, and I strongly suspect that many people listening to this have heard this acronym CRA, and maybe they're trying to Google it. Maybe you're finding a good solution, maybe you're not. But this is legislation that went into effect in Europe in April of this year. There is currently a working group of the Eclipse Foundation that is being created because there's going to be discussion around standardizing some of the implementation around it. Tracy and I are super excited to say that we're going to do a reading group focused on maintainers, where we're going to read this legislation and we are going to collect the maintainer feedback and bring it to this working group. And also, I mean, help people understand how they can show up at the meeting, like all of that. It's not like we're trying to like take the place of people, but like try and create a space for people. Like I think a lot of folks don't even know this is happening right now. And so I think it's really valuable to like spread awareness, but also like deep understanding and be able to like solicit feedback and create a loop there. So we're going to be.
Where can I join in those conversations without using Twitter?
You don't have to use Twitter. It's fine. You might have to use GitHub though. Is GitHub okay?
Yep. I have a GitHub account. So yeah.
We have a GitHub org and we'll have it in the show notes by the time this comes out. We'll put it all in there. But you can sign up there and we'll be doing weekly readings of it.
Will this GitHub community have an individual maintainer representative or community committee or code of conduct or anything else that is necessary for any open source project? Yes, it will. Okay, cool.
Who are you talking to, Richard?
Tracy, where can we find you on the interwebs?
Oh, man. I mean, same. That's at Twitter is what I will call it until my dying day. So happy-go-lucky. Twitter, Mastodon, some Slacks and Discord, if you so please. I'm happy to talk via email too. But yeah, I think the GitHub repo is going to be a great way for us to have conversations focused around that work. And
thank you so much for coming on and talking about it. Thank you for talking about the CRA in public so people can join in, especially as I know both of you are not European. It's great to see that Americans are also waking up and listening.
Well, I wish I were. Does that count?
I know. I tried for years. Didn't work out. That's okay. This is now the part of the show called Spotlight, where we highlight other people projects or things that are not our little pet projects and pet peeves, but really just other people that need light shed on them. Traditionally, the host goes first. So my spotlight today is going to be Jingna Zhang, whose name I have probably mispronounced, who is super awesome. Not only did she win a court case in Luxembourg where some just slimeball copied her photo using AI and said, hey, this is like a new photo entry that I put in for art. And she's like, excuse me, that was my photo I took and you're kind of a jerk. And she won that court case, which is a big thing ever there. But she also has started a new social network that is just awesome. If you haven't checked out Cara yet, CARA.app, do check out Cara. It is for artists to put up their artwork, and it's intentionally made to make it incredibly difficult or impossible for AI to scope up and slurp up all of your art and then brutally not compensate you for their own benefit. So check out Cara. It's the best. And Jingna Zhang, you're amazing. Keep up the good work. Tracy, what is your spotlight today?
I initially walked in with another one, but I realized that in our conversation today, it's an oldie but a goodie, and it's a book. It's Working in Public, the Making and Maintenance of Open Source Software by Nadia Eghbal, who goes by a different name, but the author, her author listing is still Nadia Eghbal. And it just was a good reminder to me of, I think, a lot of the things that I've taken for granted that's just very like standard knowledge because we've been so far down the rabbit hole for so long. But everyone should go check it out. There's a bunch of different ways you can buy it.
That's easily the most spotlit book of all time.
No,
I think it was the last
I'm so
one.
Basic.
Anyway, we've also had Nadia on this podcast to talk about it. Ashley Williams, what's your spotlight today?
I think I have one, but I don't know if this is going to make me sound like really kumbaya or not.
Do it.
Okay. I want to spotlight exercising for mental health. So, as I think I alluded to a couple times over the course of this podcast, but is also just known about me, like I am so grumpy. I'm often very cynical. I'm always trying to solve like extremely hard problems where like all the odds are against me. And it like super messes with my head, like hard. And I spent a lot of time like really struggling with like mental health stuff. I started just like, I do like this particular gym thing, but I work out like every other day now. And it has been like single-handedly the best thing that's ever happened to me. Like I am such a happier person. I know it's not like a link, but like if you like have heard people say like your mental health improves with exercise and you've been like, I don't know, like please, like from like an OG grump, like it's so good. Like just go run, go lift some heavy stuff. It is literal magical brain juice. It's very good for you. And I would not be able to continue doing this work if I did not do that.
Likewise, also as little as 45 minutes twice a week of cardio is enough to get enough benefits, 95%. So go do the Pareto principle while taking a long walk. Thank you so much for coming on. It was really great to have you and have this sort of meandering discussion about why everything is broken and how we can maybe fix it some way. Very excited about that. Listeners, if you've enjoyed this podcast, do let me know. Podcast@sustainoss.org goes to me. Also, Richard at The user is mymom.com, one of my emails. That goes to me. So let me know what you thought about it and what you think about open source in general. I'd love to have more guests. I'd love to have more thoughts. Also, you can go to opencollective.com/sustainoss if you want to donate to this podcast. It is not free work. I would love to be able to keep doing it. So please go and donate if you haven't yet, and get your bosses to donate. That's cool. On top of that, share it. Tell everyone you know. Come talk about this. That'd be really awesome. And like it on Apple, Spotify, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The show notes, of course, are at podcast.sustainoss.org. If Ashley or Tracy pings me on Blue Sky or Mastodon or LinkedIn, where Sustain is and where I am, I will retweet whatever, I guess not on Twitter, but I'll share the GitHub link where they're going to be talking about the CRA. I'm very excited to be there on behalf of academics because I'm starting a PhD program soon, and I think that universities also should care about this stuff. So come join me. Thank you so much, Tracy, AgDubs.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Always a pleasure.